In September of 2020, a man named Liang Jing crossed the finish line of the Yellow River Stone Forest Ultramarathon, winning it for the third consecutive time. As sweat dripped down his face, he was greeted by local politician and race promoter Li Zuobi, who personally draped a medal around the champion's neck. The two men shook hands and posed for photos, a perfect political moment showcasing both athletic excellence and economic progress. 8 months later, both men would be dead. The 2020 Yellow River Stone Forest Ultramarathon may have ended in success, but the following year, this very same race would end up killing 21 elite athletes in what would become the deadliest marathon in all of history. But the thing is, this isn't just a story about a race going wrong. This is a story about what happens when politics, ego, and complete and utter incompetence all collide with the wrath of Mother Nature.
21 people have died after extreme weather struck runners participating in a 100-kilometer ultramarathon.
Rescuers are saying that one participant is still missing.
I'm gonna take you hour by hour through this disaster as it unfolded on that fateful day in May of 2021. And I'm not gonna stop there either, because this race was such a, pardon my language, a show that its carnage didn't even end once the race was over. By the end of this video, you're gonna hear why the very same man who handed out the winners' medals would drop dead in a twist that nobody saw coming. At 6 a.m. on May 22nd, 2021, elite runner Yan Diaxian woke up in her hotel room to what appeared to be decent conditions. I'm talking blue skies, temperatures in like the 50s Fahrenheit, which is about 10 degrees Celsius. And yet, despite these optimal conditions, we'll say, and unlike many of her competitors for that matter, she decided to dress conservatively, opting for gloves, warm pants, and even some arm warmers. She methodically packed her running vest with electrolytes, chocolate, and some of those disgusting energy gels that runners use. You've seen those before. And of course, plenty of water. Now, what you have to understand is that the Yellow River Stone Forest 100K Ultramarathon was not a normal race. I mean, for starters, I just said it, 100 kilometers is just about 62 miles of running, which is insane, right? I mean, that's more than double the length of a normal marathon, right? So launched in 2018, this ultramarathon was the brainchild of officials in Jingtai County, which is one of the poorest regions in China's already impoverished Gansu province. Now, those of you that watch my videos on the regular are probably aware that I'm not very good at pronouncing things, like even English words, which is my native tongue. And this story took place in China, and so I'm going to be saying a lot of Chinese names, and I'm doing my best. I really tried to verify the pronunciation, but I'm probably going to butcher them, and so you can cringe along with me. Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that. I'm doing my best, okay? Li Zuobi, who was the county's Chinese Communist Party chief, had this grand vision of the race as this like tourism initiative to help kind of lift his region out of poverty. In fact, at one point, he had personally traveled to the Chinese capital of Beijing in order to promote this race in front of higher-up CCP officials. And it seemed like things were going pretty well. By September of 2020, Li's government had officially declared the county poverty-free. I'm not sure how that's possible, but regardless, this reoccurring, successful ultramarathon had been a symbol of that achievement. For the 2 previous years, the race had experienced nothing but pretty much perfect weather. Like, again, sunny skies and moderate temperatures. And the course, which wound through the scenic Yellow River Stone Forest, had drawn more and more elite competitive runners with each passing year. By 2021, the race featured a lot of China's top ultra runners, which included 3-time champion Liang Jing, who was largely considered the most famous trail runner in all of China. Anyways, going back to the morning of May 22nd, another runner who was named Zhang Xiao was also getting himself ready. Now, he had trained specifically for the desert heat, expecting conditions that were going to be similar to the race in previous years. The night before the race, the organizers had held this briefing, and they had only cautioned the runners about heat stroke and sunburns, despite the weather forecasts suggesting something very different approaching. By 7 a.m., with only 2 hours until the race was set to begin, the temperature was just about 60 degrees Fahrenheit or about 15 degrees Celsius. And yet, despite, once again, the mild temperature, those arriving at the starting area could kind of just feel that the weather for this year's race was going to be drastically different than years past. And a big reason for that was the wind. It was blowing like crazy, it was violent, erratic, and perhaps most concerningly is that it was growing stronger by the second. Wind gusts were slamming into the starting area with enough force to knock over race signs, rip flags from their poles, and send debris just kind of scattering across the ground, kind of like warning shots. Some runners, already shaking from the cold before the race had even started, well, they stumbled into a nearby gift shop, desperate to kind of just get some warmth and shelter, and maybe just a moment to collect themselves before they began running. Looking around the starting area, Yan Diaxian noticed that she was one of the few runners that was actually dressed for colder temperatures. Most of them wore only, shorts and a t-shirt, having given up their warm clothing the night before, expecting to grab it at an aid station much later in the race. This was like a little system the race had going. Around 10 p.m. the previous night, Bian, which is the town the race started in, had issued a wind warning, albeit the lowest grade of their 4-grade system. The Provincial Weather Center had also warned about, quote, massive yellow dust and sand carried by winds, temperature drops, and precipitation. And you'd think that would have been significant, but these warnings were not passed on to the runners, at least not explicitly, we'll say. Instead, race organizers, like I just mentioned there, had offered to collect the runners' night supplies and their warmer gear and place them at an aid station, which was roughly, some 38 miles or 62 kilometers into the race. And most of the runners, expecting another hot day like all the previous years, well, they gladly handed over their jackets and their warm clothing. I mean, it would be much easier to run and therefore make you more likely to win if you weren't being bogged down by a bunch of extra weight that you didn't really need to carry. At precisely 9 a.m., the mayor of Bian, standing at the starting line, raised a pistol straight into the air and pulled the trigger. Almost instantly, 172 runners surged forward and began barreling off into the distance. The race had started, folks, and by this point, the weather had deteriorated even further. But honestly, the real challenge came at the very first turn in the race course. Now, I'm not gonna lie, folks, this story is about to get very disturbing. All the way until the twist that comes at the very end of this video that I told you about a few minutes ago. And so anyways, before we get into like the really dark stuff, I do want to kind of just lighten the mood for a moment and tell you about Drink Element. Element is the sponsor of this video. Now, I've never ran an ultramarathon, but I'm kind of thinking about maybe doing one this summer, which maybe I'll be rethinking after I finish this video. But regardless, if I do an ultramarathon, I'm going to be taking Drink Element with me. And it's not just for marathon runners or elite athletes like myself, totally. It's for anyone who sweats, which includes you, because I know you sweat before. Don't try to hide it. When you sweat a lot, you need to replace your electrolytes, because if you don't, you'll get muscle cramps and you'll get fatigue. It's just not good. And you want to do it with Drink Element over all of the other electrolyte drink mixes, and here's why. Element does not have any sugar or any crap in it. All it has is the electrolytes that you need to stay hydrated and healthy, and it has a great taste. And speaking of that, Element just launched what is probably my new favorite flavor, and that is lemonade salt. Just in time for summer. I mean, just imagine you're out for like a hot run, or you're out doing yard work or whatever, and you're dripping sweat. I mean, what sounds better than some fresh Element lemonade? I mean, it's seriously so good, and you really want to try it. And so here's what you can do. Go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Make a purchase on their website. Again, I would recommend the lemonade salt, frankly. And when you do that through my link, you're going to get a sample pack of 8 additional Element flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. You got to do it. So one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go buy some lemonade salt and get that sample pack for no extra cost. And all right, let's get back to the video. So among the 172 registered participants in the race were runners like Huang Guanju, who had won the men's hearing impaired marathon at the 2019 National Paralympic Games. Huang had spent much of his life kind of bouncing around between temporary jobs, doing his absolute best to make ends meet, but eventually he discovered that he could actually make a full-time living just from his race winnings. And Leon Jing, that three-time champion who I mentioned earlier, he was very much in the same boat. I mean, years ago, he too had abandoned his daily job. He used to work as like a delivery driver, and he basically said, screw that, I'm gonna become a professional runner. He discovered that he could make more money running ultramarathons than working a regular job. All he had to do was make sure that he won. For Huang, Liang, and many, many other runners, this was not just like a turkey trot. This wasn't just some fun run. It wasn't even a serious challenge or just an opportunity to accomplish a personal goal. This was literally their job. Their livelihoods depended on winning, and they were going to do whatever it took in order to get that cash. So as the course left the stone road at the very beginning behind and turned sharply into a valley, all of the runners were suddenly hit with a massive gust of wind that sent hats and other clothing flying in all directions. The race had literally just started, and already Mother Nature had issued her most explicit warning so far. And yet, despite this warning sign, Liang Jing and all of the other elite runners at the very beginning charged ahead. As Zhang Xiao continued running, he too was affected by the extreme wind. However, he knew that these types of races were tough. Again, I've never ran an ultramarathon, but from what I understand, runners will often put up this mental wall that kind of allows them to push through difficult moments during the race. And presumably because of this, Zhang Xiao wrote the weather off as just kind of normal, right? It was just part of the challenge of an ultramarathon. Now, going back to Li Zuobi, though he was the race's biggest supporter and had a lot to benefit from the race politically, he did not run himself. As the county's CCP chief, he had other responsibilities that day, but of course this race remained his vision, a showcase of what his leadership specifically, had brought to this formerly impoverished corner of China. And so he was watching very, very closely. By 10 a.m., just 1 hour into the race, the apparent temperature at the third checkpoint, which sat higher up in the mountains, had plummeted to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, or just around 1 degree Celsius. I mean, just barely over freezing is what I'm talking about here. A fierce, unexpected cold front had just swept in, and it was beginning to hit the north-facing slopes of the course. At 10:42 a.m., Liang Jing reached checkpoint 2. He had been in first place since the moment that he left the starting line, and at this point, he was still leading the race. But by now, the wind had gotten fiercer, and to make matters even worse than that, a light rain had intensified into just a full-on downpour. The section of the course between checkpoints 2 and 3, which was the highest and most exposed part of the course, was rapidly becoming a death trap as temperatures continued dropping by the minute. And I promise you, that is not just me being dramatic. By 11 a.m., more and more runners were reaching checkpoint 2, each facing the same critical decision. They either had to continue climbing into increasingly dangerous conditions, or they had to turn back and give up on finishing the race entirely, let alone actually winning it. Nobody knew it yet, but by 11:09 in the morning, the first of only 4 runners who would eventually survive to checkpoint 4 reached this crucial juncture. Some runners began throwing in the towel at checkpoint 2, turning back and turning around and heading back down the mountain, and warning others who were still coming up in the process. But at the same time, many runners decided to press on. I mean, they were competitors after all. They wanted to win, or at least put up the best possible finishing time that they could, right? Conditions were bad, but spirits were still high. And after all, this was a professionally sanctioned race. I mean, of course, there should be people looking out for their safety, right? I mean, how dangerous could it really be? By 11:20 a.m., the apparent temperature at checkpoint 3 had plunged well below freezing to 23 degrees Fahrenheit or -5 Celsius. It was also getting nearly impossible to see. I mean, visibility was rapidly decreasing as all of this fog and precipitation blew in. The wind was so strong that it was literally blowing away trail markers, which made navigating the already difficult course basically impossible. It's just a really bad situation. And then at 11:50 a.m., a desperate runner sent the very first distress message via their GPS. This message never received a response, and tragically, it would not be the last. By 12 o'clock noon, the situation on the mountain had turned catastrophic. Heavy rain mixed with hail was now just pounding the exposed section of the course, and runners caught between checkpoints 2 and 3 faced the worst of all the conditions. And once again, I want to remind you that most of them were only wearing shorts and t-shirts. They had left behind their colder weather gear so that they could pick it up further down the course when they thought that they would actually need it. The runners were left with absolutely no protection against the elements. At 12:17 p.m., the first distress message that actually was received reached race officials. And then shortly after that, at 12:30 p.m., a haunting photo surfaced which showed 10 runners huddled together with their emergency blankets, again, the only protection they had, being completely torn apart by the relentless winds. By this point, visibility had dropped to less than 15 feet. The trail had become increasingly slippery, a very bad thing to combine with the numerous dangerous cliff edges that were literally just one wrong step away for all of these runners. Multiple people began experiencing the classic symptoms of hypothermia, right? Loss of feeling in your extremities, uncontrollable violent shaking, mental confusion, and even partial loss of motor function. It was around this time that Zhang Zhongxiao encountered 2 fellow runners that were in serious trouble. He tried to assist one of them, a racer who just could not stop shaking, but after a failed attempt to kind of walk together, Zhang had no choice but to continue on all by himself. This decision would almost certainly end up saving his life, and yet at the same time, it of course would go on to haunt his conscience, probably forever. Now, further back on the course, Yan Diaxian had decided that she had enough, and so she joined up with another runner who was named Qi Li, and the two of them decided to turn back around and go back down the mountain, right? This sounds simple in theory, but in practice, it was extremely difficult. And eventually it got to the point where the 2 runners realized that they weren't even on the course anymore. They were completely lost. I mean, visibility was so bad that they had no idea where they were going and essentially just had to kind of hope and pray that they would stumble into some sort of safety. Yan knew that she was dangerously close to death at this point. I mean, one wrong move, that would be all it took. And as it turns out, this gut feeling that she had was right, because this is the point in the story where runners began dropping like flies. By 1 p.m., the actual temperature on the mountain had risen to a balmy 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius, which that's sarcasm, obviously. And just to add to that, the extreme wind chill, that hadn't died down. That did not make things feel any warmer whatsoever. At 1:08 p.m., Liang Jing's sports watch recorded a heart rate of 0. The 3-time champion and father had become one of the very first people to die on the mountain. GPS data would later reveal that his final kilometer took an agonizing 57 minutes, and it showed him basically just kind of moving around in this desperate zigzag pattern as he struggled to find shelter before eventually succumbing to the elements, which is very, very tragic. And folks, he would not be the last. Around 2 p.m., as elite runners began dying on the mountain, a shepherd named Zhu Kemming was tending his sheep on a hill near the course when he spotted several collapsed runners on the trail off in the distance. Now, frankly, this was none of his business, right? I mean, he could have just kind of pretended that he never saw anything and then kind of slunk back into the shadows, not wanting to get involved. It's not his problem. But instead of doing that, Zhu, who maintained a heated cave dwelling in the area, immediately sprang into action. He found multiple unconscious runners exhibiting severe hypothermia symptoms, and he carried them into this heated cave. Some of them regained consciousness and welcomed the refuge that the cave provided from the disaster unfolding back on the course. However, some of the runners never woke up at all. While searching for other survivors, Zhu would soon discover 3 more runners who had already died, just outside the entrance to his cave. Around 2 p.m., a private search team called Blue Sky Rescue managed to rescue 18 runners by guiding them to a lodge down the mountain. And at the same time that this effort was taking place, Yan Diaxian and Qi Li, still kind of stumbling around through the whiteout conditions, barely managed to spot this cave through the fog off in the distance. And of course, as they got closer, they saw Zhu Kemming standing there at the entrance. Zhu waved Yan and Qi inside the cave, and he was already sheltering another runner at this point, wrapped in emergency blankets, a runner that was clearly suffering from hypothermia. And upon seeing this, Yan immediately got to work making sure that she would not suffer the same fate. She stopped and removed her wet socks and shoes, and she even tucked her feet under another runner's hips to kind of give her some warmth, right? Zhu told her that he had already called for help, further down the mountain, but nobody had answered him. Yan then informed him that herself and the rest of the runners were almost surely gonna die unless he started a fire. And of course, Zhu realized this himself, and so he sprang into action, quickly gathering up a bunch of firewood before igniting it into this incredibly bright, crackling blaze, one of the only sources of heat and, frankly, hope in an environment that was rapidly turning more deadly by the second. At 2:30 p.m., race administrators called the mayor of a nearby town with some very ambiguous instructions. They asked for, quote, winter supplies for the runners. Now, this vague and non-urgent directive was quickly kind of just delegated somewhere else and ultimately proved to be yet another glaring example of the terrible, incompetent communication on May 22nd, 2021. And around this same time, 2 more runners arrived at Zhu's cave, and their report was incredibly grim. They had found multiple unconscious runners on their way up the mountain, and they had even checked a lot of them for pulses. Some of them were still alive, but a lot of them were not. There were no pulses. However, they did notice that there was a man who was badly cramping, in bad shape, but still alive, located just a short distance away from the entrance of the cave. At 3 p.m., a man named Kong Ming received a call from the race organizer asking to help a particular injured runner down the mountain. Kong courageously set out into these brutal conditions, and after hiking for what felt like an eternity, he finally neared the top of his climb. He was just about to crest the ridge when all of a sudden he spotted smoke rising out from this nearby cave. Of course, we all know what cave I'm talking about here. And so Kong and Zhu would end up briefly chatting kind of at the entrance to the cave, and Zhu told him about how dire the situation was. I mean, there were multiple runners, most of whom were in critical condition, all huddled inside of his cave. And in addition to that, Zhu knew that there were even more runners, a lot of whom were already dead, scattered along the trail further past the cave. And so with this, Kong, who was only sent up there to rescue one, individual runner, well, his rescue mission had now turned into this frantic scramble to save as many runners as he could possibly find. And so he left the safety of the cave and threw himself back into the dangerous wrath of Mother Nature. And it wasn't long until he stumbled upon a sight that left him completely shocked, we'll say. Kong found a runner laying on the ground with his eyes shut as if he was just kind of laying there sleeping. And of course, you guys probably know this already, this man was obviously not sleeping, he was dead. And so instinctively, Kong decided to kind of glance down at the dead man's bib number. And when he did this, his brain basically refused to process what he was looking at. This runner's bib number was number 1, the very first one. And that meant that the man that was collapsed dead in front of Kong was none other than Liang Jing himself, the most famous, the most talented, and beloved ultra runner in the entire country of China. And as shocking as that was, it gets even worse because Kong knew that if a man of Liang's strength and endurance and physical fitness had succumbed to the elements, then surely there was going to be many, many more people who suffered the same fate. Folks, at this point, the Yellow River Stone Forest Ultramarathon was now flirting with becoming a full-on mass casualty event. Around the same time that this was all going down, Zhu went out on yet another rescue mission, this time to find that runner who had been reportedly cramping nearby the cave entrance, but still was alive, right? And Zhu, being the hero that he is, well, of course, he did manage to find this runner. But that doesn't mean the prognosis was good. The runner, hardly even conscious at this point, kept whispering the same phrase over and over. He kept saying, "I'm in fourth place. I'm in fourth place. I'm in fourth place." This runner was who else but Zhang Zhongxiao. Zhang had been lying out there in the cold for over 2 hours by this point, and like many of the other runners on this fateful day, he had used his GPS to send out an emergency SOS, but just like many other runners on this fateful day, his call had not been answered. Zhu called out to Qi Li for help, and together the two of them dragged Zhang back inside. He was barely responsive, he was completely disoriented, and he just continued to mumble about the race. They laid him just inside the cave entrance to avoid a bunch of smoke from the fire, and his clothes were completely soaked, his fingers were stiff, and his body, not just his mind, had clearly started to just shut down. "I'm in fourth. I'm in fourth. I'm in fourth," is what he kept repeating. Yan, who at this point had actually started to recover from her previous life or death state, well, she stepped in to help Zhang. And it wasn't just her, actually. She was assisted by all of the other runners who were stable enough to provide assistance. And so they removed Zhang's wet clothing and they placed them near the fire to dry. Yan also warned the others not to rub Zhang's limbs or to warm his hands too quickly, because she knew that forcing cold blood back into his core too fast could actually end up killing him. And so instead, she offered him these small sips of water, whatever snacks that she could scrape together, and of course, she offered him some of those disgusting energy gels that runners use. Why do they use those? Little by little, Zhang started eating and slowly started recovering. And so we're gonna go back down into town for a moment here. We're gonna leave the cave, and this is when something incredibly frustrating happened. And so back down by the starting line, it was now about 3:30 p.m. And it was at this point that a local resident finally called in an emergency about the race. And like a proper rescue, mostly spearheaded by firefighters, was launched. 3:30, and they're finally realizing how bad things were. You know, they had some inklings before this, but 3:30 is when it actually set in, and they were like, whoa, we gotta get to work here. And that might sound ridiculous to you that, you know, that it took this long, but the truth is that the organizers back on the ground, they just, I don't know why they didn't understand how bad things were until now, but that's essentially what happened. And then about an hour later, at say 4:20 p.m., firefighters were finally dispatched, but they were located over 20 miles away from the course, so it was going to take them a while. At 4:42 p.m., Zhu Keming was finally able to get some cell signal for the first time since the start of all of this, and he began to report the deaths back down to those who were in town. At 5 p.m., local villagers, you know, not trained rescue professionals, but just local people trying to help, well, they arrived at Zhu's cave with blankets, hot water, hot drinks, and other important supplies. Yan immediately sent them back onto the course to search for more runners where they would be better utilized. And then shortly after this, the weather finally relented, and the survivors in Zhu's cave decided that it was time to get back down to safety before it got too dark. They wrapped themselves in towels, and Zhu guided them down a short side trail that was not part of the race course. It was, you know, a shortcut to get back down, essentially. At 5:45 p.m., firefighters finally arrived at the fourth checkpoint. And then between 6 and 7 p.m., a local villager found and rescued a surviving runner who was literally foaming at the mouth. By 8 p.m., 60 able-bodied men from a local village had hiked up to the now infamous third checkpoint. And around the same time, Yan and other survivors finally arrived back at their hotel, where they had a very tense and quiet dinner with fellow survivors. The only conversation topic, if you could even call it that, it feels weird calling it that, but the only conversation topic we'll say was about who might still be alive on the mountain. At 8:20 p.m., the last living runner was rescued off the course. At 9 p.m., firefighters hiked up to the third checkpoint with thermal imaging drones and radar. But of course, they got lost in the dark several times and ended up just relying on villagers for guidance. The firefighters weren't equipped or trained, for that matter, to identify hypothermia and did not attempt CPR on any runners who looked dead, whatever that means. Rescue efforts continued through the night, and at midnight, GPS data showed runner Wu Panrong was still moving, essentially walking himself in circles in order to try to keep warm. And tragically, despite the fact that rescue operations were underway at this point, help never reached him, and he would end up dying during the night. At some point that GPS track stopped, and he would end up being one of the last deaths of this entire event. But not the very last. The last death would come actually days later, and it wasn't even the death of a runner, but we'll get there. By morning, 18 runners were confirmed dead, with 3 still out there missing. And soon the official death toll would be announced, of course, as 21 runners, 18 men and 3 women. All victims had been from the very beginning of the runner pack, like the people who started, the quickest. And this just so happened to work out because the storm happened to hit when the lead pack was at the highest elevation on the course. In addition to the deaths, 8 more runners were seriously injured but would go on to survive. And astonishingly, only 4 of the 172 participants made it all the way to the 4th checkpoint. Most of the people who survived had been just further back in the pack and had just been lucky and missed the worst of the storm. Local officials that had championed, promoted, and overseen this race were now under incredible scrutiny. And Li Zuobi, specifically, again, the county's Chinese Communist Party chief, well, he was now facing the worst crisis of his career. And folks, it was actually about to get even worse for him. But once again, we'll get there. In the days that followed, the Chinese government launched an investigation into this disaster. And they also took the very bold step of suspending all extreme sports nationwide. Criminal investigations were opened left and right. And as pressure mounted, it became clear that someone was going to have to pay. Like, someone was going to have to be held responsible for this disaster. And as pressure mounted, it became crystal clear that disciplinary actions against those responsible, including Li Zuobi, of course, would be severe. The official investigation found multiple critical failures, including neglecting weather warnings, which I talked about, failing to require runners to carry warm clothing, which I also talked about, insufficient medical and supply stations along the course, poor communication channels for emergency calls, and poorly organized rescue efforts. For the survivors, the physical and psychological scars were just severe. Zhang Zhangxiao's left index finger stayed numb from nerve damage. He would even go on to suspend his social media accounts after facing harassment online from people who kind of questioned some of his decisions during the disaster. And as for Yan Diaxian, well, she would experience flashbacks and have trouble sleeping for months. She even kept in touch with Zhang and some of the other survivors for kind of just, moral support. And she maintained contact with Shepherd Zhu Keming, periodically sending him gifts in gratitude for saving her life. Oh, and speaking of Zhu, who saved at least 6 lives on that fateful day, the tragic irony was not lost. I mean, the same mountains that had provided him a simple life for decades had been transformed into this deadly showcase for economic progress or whatever they were trying to do. His humble cave, heated by just simple fires, ultimately provided more protection to the desperate runners than all of the technological advancements and organizational infrastructure of modern China. And now for Li Zuobi. So this race had symbolized everything he had worked for in his career. But now, as investigators dug deeply into this tragedy, it was clear that someone had to be held accountable for these 21 deaths. The pressure on all of the local officials was intense, and as the days passed, Li Zuobi found himself increasingly targeted. On June 9th, 2021, less than 3 weeks after the tragedy, the 22nd and final victim of the Yellow River Stone Forest Ultramarathon would end up dying. Li Zuobi ended his own life by jumping from his high-rise apartment building. And that very same day, disciplinary actions were announced against 31 officials. Li Zuobi, however, was exempted from punishment after his death. Now, many questioned whether he had been a scapegoat, essentially, kind of forced to shoulder the blame for all of these systemic failures and bureaucracy. You can debate that, but the man who had proudly promoted this race as a way to lift his region out of poverty had now been destroyed by it. My heart goes out to all the victims of this race. Once again, I apologize for the pronunciation in this video as well. And YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click. And folks, I'll see all of you in the next video.